Welcome to another episode of Lifting the Lid on Technology. I'm Barry White, your host and VCIO at Softsource vBridge. Today's episode is proudly brought to you by HPE Aruba Networking, our partner in creating secure and intelligent network solutions. If you want to dig deeper into any of the topics we talk about today, be sure to check out our blog at svbgroup.co.nz/blog or connect with us on LinkedIn. We'd love to hear your comments. Today, I'm joined by Alex, Security Software Development Consultant for Softsource vBridge, and from across the ditch, Steve Isles, SASE Leader for ANZ for HPE Aruba. Thank you, gentlemen. Good to see you.
Good to be back.
So today I thought we'd take a slightly different spin on this. We're going to, again, be talking mainly about security today, but we've done a few podcasts down that line, but I thought we'd look at it through a slightly different lens today and really talk more about it from the attacker's point of view rather than from a sort of defense strategy. Although we'll touch on some of that as well. Alex, maybe you could just introduce yourself and tell our audience a little bit about what you do at Softsource vBridge.
Yep, I'm Alex. It's all pretty simple. For Softsource, I'm a penetration tester, and I do quite a bit of bug bounty hunting. I did used to do quite a bit of programming and security research, but these days it's pen testing and bug bounty hunting.
And if I could ask it's more for my own benefit, this question than anything, but the term ethical hacker, is that one of these terms that makes you kind of raise your eyebrows and say, oh, don't call me that?
Yeah, there was a really terrible certificate called a CEH, or a Certified Ethical Hacker, that was kind of done exclusively by morons, and it's sort of scorched the term a little bit. So these days, most people are just security researcher or pen tester or something like that.
Note to self, don't call you an ethical hacker.
The principle of it stands, ethical hacker.
Good stuff. Hey, so we're both at different ends of the country, and I haven't had the pleasure, as it were, of going to a face-to-face meeting with a customer with you, but I have heard the stories. You know, when us mere mortals go to visit a customer and we walk in the reception, sign into the visitor registration system, that's about as far as our mind thought goes at that point. But what's going through your mind when you go into a customer's premise? And probably more importantly, what have you done to prepare for a meeting when you're talking to a client?
That really depends. I mean, I think you might be getting at a client that's maybe going to undergo a red team test or like a physical penetration test. And in that case, obviously, any work, right? You are thinking about the work, which tends to be the physical security of the business and things of that nature. If it's just a digital pen test, then a lot of those sign-in things do tend to be vulnerable. You know, that can be a little bit of a cool trick for a first meeting with a customer. There's a very popular one in New Zealand, VizTab, which has just had cross-site scripting vulnerabilities for as long as it's been around. If you put a cross-site scripting payload in as your name, you can normally get that to trigger. And it tends to send an email to the person that you're meeting, which is really handy for triggering a cross-site scripting payload.
So I guess in some cases that first meeting could be a little uncomfortable in some cases.
No, I wouldn't do that with somebody that was going to be uncomfortable with it. If I thought that'd make them a bit nervous, I'd hold off.
Have there been situations where a customer perhaps hasn't necessarily believed you, where you've demonstrated something to you and they've sort of just not really taken it seriously or been dismissive of what you've found?
Yeah, normally third-party vendors. So maybe a pen test is being done by a customer and the vulnerable software belongs to somebody else. You know, in that case, the third party doesn't always get the full report. They might just have an email from, who we're doing the work for. And in that case, it might not have all of the evidence or all of the proof, things like that. It's, a pretty easy problem to solve. We just show them live, we can do it. So just do it again in front of them. And that tends to end those conversations pretty quick.
So in your experience and opinion, and I guess particularly through a New Zealand lens now, what's the area that most commonly gets overlooked by most organisations? I mean, they seem to invest heavily in a lot of the traditional desktop tools and those sorts of things, and sometimes spend a lot of money on it.
Yeah.
But what are the things that get overlooked commonly with large and small organisations?
There's two things that immediately come to mind. So the first is companies favoring network security. So a lot of companies hire like network technicians and things like this to install firewalls and bits of hardware that's generally kind of pointless. And they tend to completely overlook their web application security and those other kinds of real external perimeter problems. Then within that, client-side vulnerabilities are often overlooked in favor of server-side vulnerabilities. So a lot of businesses will be aware of, hey, SQL injection's bad. That means the bad guy gets our database or something like this. And that's true, that's bad. But client-side vulnerability is a lot more common and just as or more profitable.
Yeah. So can you share a sort of a real-world sort of anomalized example of cyber attack in New Zealand that you think would be interest to our audience? And what did you learn from those cyber attacks?
Well, one that's very common in New Zealand, I'm not sure why it's so common in New Zealand, it stems from what I would normally write up in a report as a medium severity vulnerability, which is HTML injections in like a controlled email source. So something like a subscribe or a contact us form on your website. You might have a very simple, just a brochure site, no real backend or anything like that. But if you subscribe, they'll send you an email saying, hey, thanks for subscribing. But the username's not, or just the first name isn't validated. And the developers think, well, it doesn't matter. We're not doing anything with it. We're just emailing you that back. Except I control the email address that's getting sent to, and I can put HTML in as the username or just the first name, something like this, which I can use to rewrite the email. So I can send emails on behalf of your company now. And if you are, let's say, a big logistics company, and I send an email from you to 30 million people with an invoice, and 20,000 people pay that invoice, I've had quite a profitable afternoon. And that seems to happen quite a lot in the New Zealand market at the moment.
We'll probably come back to that a little bit because we talked on a previous podcast about the New Zealand landscape and the sort of shifting landscape that, particularly with SMBs now being more heavily targeted perhaps than they were previously. And I've mentioned some of your thoughts around that. But Steve, it'd be good to kind of switch to you and talk, I'm keen to talk about the edge a bit and, what are some of the security challenges that you're seeing today, particularly those businesses, I guess, in a sort of a hybrid environment?
Thanks, Barry. And thanks for your insights, Alex. A lot of what you said kind of resonates with the discussions we're having with our customers collectively, and it boils down to an awareness piece. So network security, organizational security, in a lot of cases, has been designed in a bygone era. As business evolves and, maybe smaller organizations have the ability to do what grown-up organizations could do 10 years ago, it means the security implications are vastly different. And it feels like SMBs in particular, but moving up into the enterprise, are becoming more aware of that now. And I hate to mention it, but since COVID, that changed a lot of things. It meant perimeters dissolved, users are everywhere, resources they need are anywhere. And so all of those security, those vulnerabilities and those vectors kind of evolve with them. And so it feels generally like organizations are becoming more aware of it, and it's not just the big end of town. And I'm having, very frequent discussions about how, we can mitigate risk or preempt what attacks may or may not come. And it's very, very user-centric at the moment.
So you touched on legacy systems there, and can you give us some specific examples that around those sorts of risks, particularly the likes of, if an Alex is knocking on the door, what are some of the common things that directly relate to the legacy of the environment that perhaps are a little bit unique?
It's the humans, right? So if we think about, and obviously Alex is deeply skilled, he'll have a greater appreciation of this at a technical level than I would maybe. But the traditional setup was, how deep was your moat? How high were your walls, and how much can you protect what's inside those walls? Well, that's evolved now because what's inside those walls are accessible externally. And when we look at any breach notifications or, Cybersecurity Institute in Australia or CERT-NZ here, the biggest risk is people. And when we think about the legacy kind of setup, we're thinking about big firewalls in a data center, maybe 2 data centers, and people come in and they come out. And then there's VPN for external access. Well, I think we're highlighting the fact that legacy design just isn't keeping up. The bad guys are upgrading. And And it feels good to know that a lot of organizations are upgrading as well to keep pace with what Alex is talking about. But it's that traditional legacy design, the bad guys are evolving, we've got to evolve with them. And that's kind of our job.
You touched on CertNZ there, and I've just got a couple of numbers here in front of me, which are just kind of interesting to share with our audience, that and these are the latest certs for 2024-25, that 36% of New Zealanders have been impacted by an online threat in the last 6 months, which is probably a lot higher than most people probably realise. And this number kind of floored me a little bit. 1.6 billion, a conservative sizing of the financial loss suffered by New Zealanders due to online threats, which is, it's probably, pretty, for a country of our size, I think it's pretty shocking. Do you think people underestimate how many of these threats are around them now? And what we all hear about cybercrime trends, what are some of the trends we're seeing that could be directly impactful on New Zealand businesses? And is there any uniqueness there that we need to consider?
It's interesting. Do I think they're underestimating the amount of threats out there? I do. I honestly do. But it's not for lack of airtime. And what I mean by that is, you look at your news feeds, you look at the news, whatever news source you subscribe to, there invariably will be some sort of breach happened here or some sort of hack happened there. And to a degree, I think that sometimes can breed a cynicism. People get used to it. They start to diminish it as a threat, and it happens to others. So do I think people are aware of the threats around them? I think they are, but I think people, to a degree, organizations could be are still a little blasé about addressing it. What I find is special here in New Zealand is the reg compliance and security landscape, from a legislative standpoint, is starting to shake up. Scrutiny is heightening, and I think that's driving a bit of behaviour too. So, but yeah, I do think people underestimate the impact. We get way too many calls from customers where the thing has happened, and how do we resolve it? And what do we do? They're kind of buying insurance after the house is burned down to some degree, and we do what we can to kind of prevent that. Right? That's our objective.
Can I, Alice? Can I ask you the same question? I guess you could have in part answered it before when you talked about some of the things that people commonly overlook, but you're really in the front line of it, right? And you boots and all. What's your view of that from a New Zealand standpoint?
People certainly underestimate certain things, but those tend to be things that they've pushed outside of the scope of things they're worrying about to an extent. You'll see this with vulnerability classes and things of that nature. Something like a client-side path traversal, which would be a pretty common vulnerability to see exploited here in New Zealand, maybe won't get fixed by an organization that's aware of it for 6 or 7 months, just because it's a little bit hard to understand and the exploit chain is a little bit complicated, and it doesn't tend to result in like a ransomware or something like this. You probably won't ever see the request on like any server-side infrastructure or anything like that. It's only going to impact your clients. The things that are getting underreported or underseen to me are things like that, things that are never touching your server in the first place, are profitable for an attacker, but something that isn't going to make you look bad to your boss if it gets exploited because you don't know that it's getting exploited.
So do you think if we look at the New Zealand economy compared to our friends over the ditch in, say, Australia, and we are predominantly an SMB society, is that a factor in that? And you mentioned, some of these numbers that are coming out of CertNZ are probably not worth that much. But is that a factor too? Do smaller businesses tend to have a slightly more blasé attitude towards these things? And is that a factor in what we're experiencing here in New Zealand?
I couldn't say in terms of on the whole whether they're more blasé. There's a particular size or category of organization that's just big enough to have a small in-house development team, which I find is generally the worst. They can maybe afford a couple of developers and they're pumping out quite a bit of quite bespoke code versus maybe an organization that's slightly smaller and is relying on pretty standard tooling, or an organization that's significantly bigger and has maybe an in-house SOC or something like this. In terms of the differences between, say, New Zealand and Australia, I think obviously the legislation differences play a bit of a role in why Australia sees a bigger uptake in terms of pen testing and bug bounty programs. There's just more consequences to getting hacked in Australia, or at least there have been sort of historically. The size difference between organizations, to me, doesn't necessarily correlate to a good or a bad security posture. I think it really just depends about there being somebody or a team within the organization that kind of cares. If there's not, then yeah, you're going to have slightly more vulnerabilities, as you'd expect.
You've used, and just for the benefit of our audience, you mentioned an in-house SOC. I mean, could you perhaps just explain what that is?
Theoretically, it should be a security operations center, which should be, a guy or a team of people reading requests and information that's coming back from various monitoring systems and solutions and those sorts of things. In practice, especially for a smaller business, tends to be a guy that also has other roles within the business, maybe 60% of the time doing some sort of IT management and then 40% of the time reading logs and reviewing things like that. So it depends a lot. I mean, theoretically, it should be like, a NASA launch team where you got a bunch of guys in a room with some big screens and there's all these log files coming back. But that's really only the really big organizations. So within small businesses, it's normally somebody that is only spending some of their time on it. They've probably got a few bits of data coming back from a few endpoints. Maybe they've got 3 or 4 important servers that are running their exposed applications. They're grabbing the error logs and maybe the Zorg log and some things like that off those machines, pumping them into a log aggregator, and then they're going on a Tuesday and saying, hey, there was way more logs today than there was yesterday. What's going on? You
touched there on the size of IT teams and frameworks and things. I'm interested from a professional development point of view. I'd imagine doing what you do, you'd have to have a pretty broad range, more so than your average developer, around different programming languages and different frameworks and so forth. And I'm really thinking of it through the lens of somebody who's listening to this podcast and thinking, I wouldn't mind getting involved in that more. How did you get involved in doing what you do? And I know from what you've shared with me in the past, keeping those skills up to speed must be pretty much a full-time job, right?
Well, there's a few parts to that. I mean, so I did come from a programming background. I was writing a lot of code from very young, and that's a common pathway into bounty hunting and pen testing. But it's equally common to come from a sysadmin or something like that role, or a help desk role or something like that. They both have their strengths. A programmer is probably going to be finding more code-related vulnerabilities at the start versus a sysadmin that's maybe finding more configuration-related vulnerabilities at the start. And you'll both converge somewhat over time. If you're looking to get into it, really just go to HackerOne or one of these big platforms and sign an account and start trying to hack things. It's really pretty hard to do it in a vacuum. You've kind of just got to start doing it.
So it's a self-taught exercise, like learning to play guitar, right?
It has to be a self-taught exercise because, there's a common saying in medicine, right? If you hear hoofbeats, think horses, not zebras. It's the common thing that's going to be the problem. It's the inverse in security because if it's a common problem, it gets solved, right? So everything's going to be a bit unusual. And if somebody's teaching you how to find a vulnerability type, that's a bit useless because that means so everybody already knows about it. It's getting found. You need to be finding novel things. So it sort of has to be a self-taught exercise in that way. These days, that's so easy because there's all of these big bug bounty aggregation platforms and just anyone can sign up and start doing it. Which makes for a perfect playground and learning place.
There's another old saying, you can learn anything in 1,000 hours. If you want to learn to play piano, you want to learn to play guitar, 1,000 hours. Mm-hmm. You won't be any good at it, but at least you'll be able to fool your friends that you are, right? So
I tell you what, if you put 1,000 hours into one vulnerability class, like an IDOR or something like that, you'll be in the top % of people finding IDORs.
Yeah.
And you could focus on that one class and be making low 7 figures if you'd really just worked at it.
And Steve, I'm interested from an HP point of view. What has been the style of the exploitations, and have they been relatively simple things that have worked rather than complex things?
Well, a couple of things on that. Just so you know, Alex, we have a thriving bug bounty program headed up by a fellow called John Green. So please sign up if you haven't, so you can help.
Your bounties are too low for me.
Right.
I think you pay, $3,000 USD for a critical on HPE?
Really? Well, there you go. Well, I'll have a chat to John, see if we can up that, right? Don't quote me on that, though. All right. So what have I seen? Overwhelmingly, the most common exploit I see is the clicked email. from that individual in HR or payroll or somebody who clicks a thing that they shouldn't have, and then here we go again. The ransomware thing appears to be the most prevalent. Most recently, we had a significant organisation in Australia we sat down and had a session with. They had some old test and dev servers that were exposed. They quickly plugged the gaps with some assistance, and some older archived customer data was breached. I mean, there are some instances of that, but overwhelmingly, the emails that get sent that somehow people are still clicking appears to be the thing we see most thrive. And recidivism, like the amount of times that people do it again. Like we've had a similar discussion with the same organisation over a number of years, and despite the internal training and awareness piece, it continues to happen. So you know what, I'm going to say people. People are usually the biggest threat, and most of the time they don't mean it. They're just trying to do their best.
So it's a question for both of you, really. Have you observed, particularly, in fact, I was asked this question just this morning, with this age of AI and a lot of these emails have been now generated using AI, has that been impactful on the success of some of these exploitations because they're now producing more professional, better thought out email campaigns that just to fool people? Does that correlate to your observations? I guess it's a question. It's a question for both of you.
I have to say it has to. It used to be a case, and this is just an objective assessment, right? But it used to be a case of when hacking somebody, you would plan, you would have a team, it would take time, sustained effort over a period of time. These days, there are ransomware for hire outfits. There are AI engines that can help, distribute, your capability to attack. And it's no longer just the big, appliance manufacturers breaching data, or it's no longer the banks. You're hearing about schools, and you're hearing about vets, and you're hearing about other organizations that get hit. It's not just the big boys anymore. So to me, those tool sets absolutely help, expand and broaden the capability of these bad guys. Alex?
Yeah. I mean, I'm sure there's an extent to which AI is being useful in generating these emails. I don't really think generating the content for some phishing campaigns is hugely impactful on, how widely effective they are. It's pretty straightforward to write a phishing email and then to blast it out at scale. And I know there's an idea that, it'll make them more convincing. They're not really trying to be convincing. You kind of want them to be a bit rough because you're only wanting a small percentage of the people that you send them to click through. And if that happens to be the stupidest 1% of the people that you send it to, that's even better. So I don't really think that AI has been hugely impactful in, say, the uptick of phishing campaigns. Definitely with things like voice phishing, stuff like this, you're getting AI-generated voices where, especially if you've got a public-ish person, you can take their voice and use AI to, do text-to-speech with that voice. Super useful if you want to call, that person's family members or a board member within their company, something like that. But generally speaking, I'm not seeing a huge uptake just because of LLM's popularity.
On that issue, Alex, what is the most creative hack you've ever seen pulled off that you can legally talk about, I guess?
Yeah, I mean, creative is a hard thing to say. I mean, a part of that's, are you talking about creativity in terms of how novel it is or how big the impact is or something like that? But I think the example that jumps to mind for me is I had a friend who was hacking on a platform that handled, the end platform would show these album arts and things like that from a record label. But the only way to get that art there is through somebody that distributes the albums for record labels. So to trigger a payload on that page right at the end, he had to create a record label himself, sign an artist, and then, a musical artist, and then get another artist to create album art for this song that he had written for his new record label, and then get that uploaded to his record label, get a distribution deal, and then that album art would end up on the resulting page and trigger his payload through a PNG polyglot polyglots, like a payload that works in two contexts. So in this case, it's a valid PNG image, but it was also valid HTML and JavaScript. So to me, that was one of the more creative things I've seen. Just going through the effort of actually creating a record label and all of that to distribute one vulnerability, I thought was pretty cool.
Oh, with my musician's hat on, I might come and talk to you about that one later, Alex. So just to finish things off, gentlemen, I'm conscious of the time, but it's a bit of, again, another slightly fun question, and maybe, Steve, you might want to have a crack at this one yourself first up. I'm again putting you on the spot a little bit, but what's a movie or TV show that gets hacking right, or I guess equally probably gets it completely wrong? I mean, if you watch something and thought, hey, that's a pretty cool representation of what it's actually like.
Did you really have put me on the spot? You know, all I can go back to is whenever you've got those crime shows and they say enhance, and it just zooms in and makes everything clearer. That's all I can think, right? As far as a hacking movie that gets it right or wrong, geez, I can't bring one to mind. I might have to defer to Alex on that one.
Yeah, I don't know about a movie that really gets it right. Just, you know, a lot of them try and make it seem very exciting. Like there's a lot of drama, especially in the interfaces on the screen that you're seeing. You know, you're seeing like a bunch of these graphical interfaces with like blue grids and things like that, which doesn't really happen. But the classic example that a lot of hackers might use is the movie The Matrix, where Trinity's running some commands on a Linux machine using a tool called Nmap, which is a network mapper written by a guy called Fyodor. And that's a completely legit thing to do. That's something every hacker would have done and still does to this day, even though Nmap was released a long time ago, and so was The Matrix.
I can just hear about millions of Trinity fans out there going, yes, I knew it. She's real.
See, I knew The Matrix was a documentary, right? I knew it. It was just a matter of time.
Hey, look, probably a good place to finish up. And look, as always, big thank you to both of you for coming on today. And Steve, this is your third visit, so really do appreciate that. And second visit for you, Alex. And love to carry on these conversations again another time. I'm sure we could keep talking for hours, but thank you both.
Great to be here. Thank you.
Thank you for tuning in to today's episode of Lifting the Lid on Technology. We hope you found our discussion insightful. A special thanks to HPE Aruba Networking for sponsoring this episode and supporting our mission to bring you the latest tech insights. Don't forget to visit svbgroup.co.nz/blog for more updates, or reach out to us on LinkedIn to keep the dialogue going. Until next time, I'm Barry White, and we'll see you in the next episode.